I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing all right, thank you.
Our producer, Pedro Quiles, gets 50 lashes with a wet noodle. Do you know why?
No, why?
Because on Tuesday, we received a couple of questions via YouTube, and Pedro said, no problem, we'll hold those over till tomorrow. And then Wednesday comes along, he forgot all about it.
Oh,
so,
okay.
50 lashes with a wet noodle. It's coming, Pedro. I'm just telling you. Here's and I hope both these folks are still listening. This one is from G-Coy on YouTube. Are there any good values left from the fallen angels? And when they joined Satan, did God remove away all the good traits in them?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So there's one unambiguously good thing about the fallen angels and Satan, and that is the bare abstracted fact of their existence. I don't mean their existence vis-a-vis us, which is obviously a great evil towards us, or towards God, which is a great dishonor. I mean the mere fact of beingness. Right?
Yeah.
Because no creature has being, no creature is of its own accord. Everything that exists other than God exists in a participated fashion, participating in the being that is God. God is the act of subsistent being. That's the Catholic definition, philosophical definition of God. And the Neoplatonists would put it this way. They would say that God is the being that beings have, if that makes any sense to you.
It does. It does.
And so we can say, that anything that exists, merely insofar as it exists, participates in the good, insofar as existence is a good, because existence is a participation in God who is good. And being and goodness in God are convertible terms, right? They're just flip sides of the same coin, right?
Okay.
Now, obviously, when it comes to the question of moral action, what does the devil do with his being? Well, he turns it to pure evil, of course. And so there's no good in his rational action.
Yeah.
Because he acts contrary to his own good and the good of creatures, and of course against the honor and goodness of God. Now, you might abstract some other quality like, well, the devil is, he's dogged in his pursuit of evil. Perseverance. Well, isn't perseverance a virtue, Dave? Wouldn't you say that's a good thing? And here we come to a really interesting point in Thomistic virtue theory, right? St. Thomas Aquinas, and this is kind of the dominant view in the Catholic tradition, says that a virtue isn't really a virtue if you don't have it together with all the other virtues. And this is a key case in point. So you might take something like bravery, and you say, well, the soldier is sort of the ideal test case for bravery. But what about a soldier who uses quote-unquote bravery in a wanton fashion to go, pillage and rapine and pillage and all kinds of mayhem that he wreaks on some unsuspecting, helpless village, right? Well, you would hardly want to look at that guy as a model of a virtuous activity. I mean, that quality of bravery is being put to a real dastardly use. And therefore, it's really not a good in that instance. But if it's combined with justice and prudence and fortitude, and even more so with faith, hope, and charity, then you have virtue in the true sense. And so even an abstract quality like, say, perseverance on the part of the devil isn't really a virtue with a capital V, because it isn't combined with justice and charity.
Okay. Very good. Thank you so much for that, G-Coy on YouTube. And this quick one here from Claire, also on YouTube. What is confirmation, and why is baptism not enough to be fully initiated in the church?
Oh, yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. Well, whenever anybody asks a question about why is this the case rather than that in the Catholic tradition, if it comes down to a matter of divine revelation, why did God do it this way rather than that? St. Thomas Aquinas says in an ultimate extent, you can't ever posit a reason for the divine will. That's just like where the buck stops.
Right.
God did it this way, okay?
Yep.
But I think we can speculate. We can throw out some ideas about what might make this a fitting kind of initiation. And they're really ordered to two different forms of sanctification, if you will. So baptism is the regeneration of the soul in Christ. It's the death to the old man. It's the putting away of sin. It's the embrace of the new way of the cross. It's resurrection. And that is really the engine that fires the entirety of the Christian life. But for what reason? Right? Is it just there so we can have, what you might call a, quote, personal relationship with God, in quote? Or did God make us to be at the service of our neighbor in life and community? right? Well, obviously the latter.
Sure.
And confirmation is a sacrament that perfects us specifically towards that order of public life where we are sanctified and equipped to bear witness to Christ in the public sphere, up to and including through our martyrdom if necessary, but, in other modes as well. So it's a different mode. And all the sacraments convey grace, but they do it in a different mode. And so let me give you a couple others just to flesh this out, make it specific. So the priest receives grace through the sacrament of ordination, all right? It makes him holy. But for what purpose, right? It makes him holy specifically so that he can celebrate the sacraments worthily. Now, I need lots of grace. I don't need that specific grace. You see?
Right.
Marriage equips me to live a holy life, to live my marriage vows in a worthy fashion. The unmarried priest doesn't need that specific grace. Every sacrament conforms you to Christ in a specific mode.
Claire and G. Coy, thanks for your questions on YouTube. Your phone call's coming up next here on Call to Communion, 833-288-EWTN. Call now.
All day today on EWTN, we celebrate the feast of St. Gregory of Narek, Doctor of the Church.
In March of 2021, the Holy Father visited Iraq, marking the first papal visit to the country, encountering regions of Iraq once held by the Islamic State. Now, 10 years after the invasion of ISIS, we explore the impact of Pope Francis's visit and what comes next for the Christian community that was targeted by the Islamic militants.
Persecuted Christians in Iraq. An EWTN news special, Friday 8 Eastern on EWTN television and radio.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for the loving service of Pope Francis and the hope he has inspired in so many in your great mercy. Have mercy on him in his illness now, we pray, and guide the medical staff in his care. Grant him peace and healing through Christ our Lord. Amen.
If you have the iHeartRadio app, you can listen to the EWTN Radio live stream. Go to iHeartRadio and search EWTN.
Spreading the good news of salvation.
This is EWTN Radio.
It's Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on this Thursday afternoon here on EWTN Radio. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. You know, EWTN's radio network is big. We are now on domestically over 400 stations. All around the world, over 600 stations. Well, do you have a station in your area? You can find out how you can help start one right there, powered by the truth of the church and EWTN's dynamic radio programming. And by the way, we don't charge anything to radio stations all across the country. We've got a big 50,000-watt blowtorch in Atlanta. They pay $0 for EWTN's programming. And that's how we treat all this. This is all, well, Mother Angelica set up back in the day. She said, we are glad to provide you Catholic programming. You don't have to worry about the authenticity of it. You know it's going to be trustworthy if you hear it on EWTN. Anyway, all that to say, if you would like to start up a radio station in your neck of the woods, email Steve at this address, radio@EWTN.com, radio@EWTN.com. That will get the ball rolling. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. Here is Joseph in Fairfield, Iowa, listening to us today on YouTube. Hello, Joseph. What's on your mind today, sir?
Yeah, hi, Tom, and hi, Dr. Anders. Thank you for your great show. My question has to do with Dr. Anders said a little while back that the Catholic Church was committed to philosophical realism. Now, how would he describe then the commitment of the believers of Tibetan Buddhism? How would he describe their philosophical commitment?
Yeah.
And also, number two, how would he describe the philosophical commitment of the Transcendental Meditation movement, which is really, I think, a kind of non-dualistic Vedanta? So if you could contrast that philosophical realism of the Catholic Church with describe the philosophical commitment of Tibetan Buddhism and the Transcendental Meditation movement.
Sure,
I appreciate it.
sure. So let me say at the outset that this is a book, right? This is not a 5-minute phone call. I mean, what you're describing is a book project. And it's actually it's if I ever finish the manuscript I'm working on, it's the next one I have in mind to write.
Okay.
Actually, but I'm serious. I'm serious about that. I've given it a lot of thought.
Okay.
So I can't possibly do justice to this topic in the short period of time that we've got. Let me make a number of observations, if I might. First of all, the Catholic Church's attitude towards non-Christian religions is that they contain elements of truth and sanctification, and that our ecumenical disposition towards them ought to be to seek areas of commonality and not only difference, and try to seek a better world to the extent that we can by agreeing on the things that we can agree upon, right? And recognizing those commonalities when we see them. And so I would begin by saying there are elements in Tibetan Buddhism that I think a Catholic could smile upon, could look favorably upon, and this doesn't really get to the root of your question about philosophical realism, but there's a very famous Mahayana text that's from the Indian tradition, not the Tibetan one, but it's one that's taken over into the Tibetan tradition wholesale. The Way of the Bodhisattva by Shantideva, Bodhisattva Karyavatara, I think is the Sanskrit name. And there's a really good public domain translation by Stephen Batchelor out there on the internet that you can find. And when you read that text, you'll immediately relate as a Catholic to some of the attitudes and dispositions about love and self-sacrifice, and sort of the ethical orientation of that text is one that would appeal, I think, to Catholic sensibilities. And so I have great appreciation for that. And that's true of many other strands of the Buddhist tradition as well, outside of Tibet and Mahayana. But in terms of the philosophical point that you raise, one other qualification, that is that Tibetan Buddhism is not a monolith. And there's a tremendous amount of diversity within Tibetan Buddhism, and I'm far from an expert in Tibetan Buddhism. I've studied Buddhism, but more the Mahayana and the Theravada than the Tibetan, but I know a little bit about it. But there is a lot of diversity, so it's hard to wrap up in one sentence. But the sort of the dominant motif, if you will, in epistemology and metaphysics, both in Tibetan and in Mahayana, that is to say, classical Indian Buddhism, is philosophical nominalism. Philosophical nominalism, which is to say the opposite of realism. Right? And because it's committed to the principle of shunyata, or emptiness, which is the doctrine that forms are merely apparent, that substantialism, as it were, to be able to identify things according to their type and kind, as if they had you could identify concrete substances that had their own intrinsic finality. That is pretty much seen as the wrong way to go about business, right? And because it leads in the Buddhist mind to attachment. If you're attracted to the idea of substances, things having individual essences that have sort of determinate qualities, then you're likely to become attached to those. And since detachment is one of the key goals of the Eightfold Path, you want to become detached from as many things as possible, including concepts, including ideas, and substantialism and essentialism would be seen as the bugbears in that kind of a system. So, there's this exists in Theravada, but of course it really is put on the map by Nagarjuna, the great Indian philosopher of Mahayana Buddhism. And then that's taken over wholesale by Tibetan Buddhism as well. So, now that being said, if there are strains of Tibetan Buddhism that have other sensibilities. There's a kind of monism, it seems to me, that's implied in Dzogchen practice. Getting to the ground of existence is somehow coexistent with consciousness. That sounds a little bit substantial to me at one level, right? But in any event, there's a lot of diversity there, and I'd say it's by and large it's not commensurate with Catholic philosophical realism. What about transcendental meditation? Well, I know even less about the history of transcendental meditation, except that it's a kind of Western adaptation of Indian thought, and if memory serves me correct, and I could be wrong about this, I think it's an adaptation of ideas that are monistic ideas that would be typical of Advaita Vedanta, which again is something that a Catholic could definitely say there are elements of that we can appreciate, but as a philosophical system, it definitely stands at antipodes to Catholic philosophical realism.
That was kind of a 1970s thing, wasn't it? For
TM?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It really took off for a while. It sure did. Joseph, thanks so much for your call. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Glad you're with us for a call to communion on this Thursday afternoon here on EWTN. Let's go to Lucas now in Omaha, listening on the great Spirit Catholic Radio. Hey, Lucas, what's on your mind today, sir?
Hello. My wife and I just had our first baby, and we're getting ready to have him baptized. And I kind of had a silly question about whether or not holy water that we have in the holy water stoups at home, if I were to like dip my hand into it and make the sign of the cross on his forehead or anything like that, if that is allowed before he's baptized, and if it has any merit or effect before he's baptized.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. So here's the nice thing about holy water in the Catholic tradition. Provided you don't put it to a sacrilegious use, you can go hog wild with holy water. You can go hog wild. I mean, I'm not recommending this, but I've even known some enthusiastic souls that have put it in little spritzer bottles, and they go around and they holy water everything.
Oh, yeah.
And you might put the question to yourself this way. Do you think that prayer has any effect on the unbaptized? Well, I certainly hope so. Otherwise, there's no sense praying for them. I mean, we do that all the time, right? And holy water is, it is, as it were, almost like liquid prayer. I mean, the way sacramentals have their efficacy is through the intercessory power of the Church. And, it's kind of like the sign of the cross. It's prayer via sign language. And sacramentals are kind of like packing a prayer, in a lunch bag to go. You get the prayer, you get the priestly blessing attached to it, then you go cart it off someplace else and make use of it. That's kind of a silly way of thinking about it, but it's not that far off the mark. That it ultimately comes back to the intercessory power of the Church, and so it's a way of kind of packaging, if you will, prayer and intercession. It doesn't have any intrinsic efficacy in itself, as if it contained some supernatural grace the way a sacrament does.
Yeah.
But it evokes and recalls and is connected to the prayer of the Church.
Appreciate your call, Lucas. We have some lines open for you right now. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-EWTN is our number, 833-288-3986. If you prefer, you can text the letters EWTN to 58177. Here's an email now from Jorge. How is a proper burial respected when a saint's body is made into relics?
How is a proper burial respected when a saint's body is made into relics or divided? The relics are divided and distributed. Yeah. Well, they're divided to be venerated. They're divided to be venerated. Mm-hmm. And when I come up with a list of what are like just ridiculously Catholic things, if you want to come up with those like comedic top 10 lists, what are the top 10 things that Catholics traditionally do that just bug the stew out of non-Catholics, right? I think that when I was a non-Catholic, if I thought, Catholics do a lot of crazy stuff, but the craziest thing they do, man, is they walk around with dead people's bones and they venerate them. Ugh, how creepy is that? I just thought that was wild. I just thought that was just the craziest stuff. And I assumed, like many people, that, they must have picked this up from paganism. This can't possibly be a biblical thing. Nobody would be so crazy as to think that God wants you to, venerate dead people. And then I started reading history. And one of the things that I found is that the pagans from whom I assumed Christians had inherited this whole horrible practice actually thought it was pretty horrible. And we think about it, a lot of paganism views death and dead bodies as ritually impure or unclean. I mean, even ancient Judaism, well, not Judaism, I shouldn't say, that's kind of an anachronism. Even ancient Hebrew religion, if like a priest touched a dead body, he'd be ritually impure and had to go through certain ablutions before he could go into the temple. And that was not just the Hebrews. I mean, there's all kinds of traditions that do that. So the Romans, they put their temples in the city. And they put their cemeteries outside the city because you don't want to have dead bodies where you worship the gods. That'll offend the gods, and then they won't be clement and kind to you. And so what do the Christians do? Well, they run out to those cemeteries and they start having Mass, and the Romans heard about Christian love feasts with their brothers and sisters at cemeteries, and they're like, oh, that's really gross. They thought it was incest and necrophilia. That's what the Romans thought the Christians were up to out there. Because you can love feasts in a cemetery. You're like, what does that sound like, right?
Yeah.
And so that was pretty horrible stuff. So Julian the Apostate, who was a Roman emperor who left Christianity and went back to paganism, and this is one of the things that just bugged him to no end about Christians that carry around dead people's bones. So they didn't pick it up. They didn't pick it up from the pagans. Lo and behold, they actually got it from the Jews. And we find that the veneration of the dead was part and parcel of Jewish tradition, and does also go back to different strands of the Hebrew tradition as well. And you all the way back into the book of Kings, you see the prophet Elijah, whose relics are powerful for miracles in the life of the people of God. And Jesus makes a kind of offhanded allusion to the practice when he talks to the Pharisees about the contemporary practice of decorating the tombs of the martyrs, right? And archaeologically, we know that was going on in Judahite burial practices for a long time. And of course, it was always a part of the Christian practice as well. And so I thought, this is kind of wild. And as I'm studying, and then I read guys like St. Jerome, who in the 4th century can say of the veneration of relics, he says, does the Bishop of Rome do wrong? And when he offers the holy sacrifice over the bones of Peter and Paul, and not the Bishop of Rome only, but all the bishops throughout the world, meaning it's a totally universal practice.
Yeah.
Historians like Peter Brown acknowledge that you can track the progress of Christianity in the ancient world by looking archaeologically for evidence of shrines to the martyrs and the relic cult, that the Christianity and the veneration of relics was coextensive, like you couldn't have one without the other. And I thought, well, my goodness, there's got to be something to this. What's going on? And I thought more deeply about the biblical teaching that we are members of Christ through our baptism, and that's more than a metaphor, that there's a mystical reality there. St. Paul can say, don't go in for prostitutes because you unite the body of Christ with a prostitute. There's a kind of double profanation there. That it's in virtue of that union with Christ's body that my physical body will be raised from the dead as his body was raised from the dead. It's kind of like Jesus is the engine and I'm the caboose on the train. We're both attached to the same device, but his motive power is what drags me through the waters of death and hell and out the other side. And it's that dynamic of our mutual belonging to Christ in his body that the veneration of relics evokes, right? That this is not just some decayed piece of matter here, but these bones will again live because they're members of Jesus. St. Gregory of Nyssa once said, we don't worship the dead, we venerate Christ in his members.
There you go. Thanks so much for your email. Here's a quick question from David watching us on YouTube today. David says, how could Mary and the saints hear an individual's prayers? Wouldn't this require omniscience and omnipresence?
Very good question. We get this one a lot. So 2 things to note. First of all, are there infinite prayers to Mary and the saints? No, because there aren't infinite people. There's a finite number of people. Do you have any concept about how many finite prayers a glorified intellect will be capable of understanding? I don't have any knowledge of what that limit will be. I mean, You remember Big Blue, the chess computer?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I wonder how many calculations it could run in a second. Well, I mean, any reason to think that Mary's glorified intellect is less powerful than Big Blue? I don't know. I mean, how do I know? I mean, it's still finite. It's not omniscient. It's still finite, right?
Yeah.
However, I don't think we have to go there, right? Because the church doesn't actually teach that Mary is personally conscious of every prayer offered to her. Maybe she is, but the church doesn't say that. It just says she prays for those who ask for her intercession. So maybe she just says, God, hear the prayers of all those who ask my intercession. Boom, job done.
There you go. David, thanks for watching us today on YouTube. In a moment, we'll go to Moses in Phoenix. Steve, a first-time caller from Western Wisconsin. A couple lines open for you at 833-288-EWTN for Call to Communion. Stay with us.
Hi, this is Father Mike Schmitz. Please join me for Ascension's Bible in a Year and Catechism in a Year here on EWTN Radio. We're going through the entire Bible and the Catechism in 365 days. If you've ever wanted to understand what it means to be Catholic and allow those truths to shape your life, this is for you.
Bible in a Year and Catechism in a Year with Father Mike Schmitz, tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific on EWTN Radio.
Don't miss a moment of 2025. Get a full year of EWTN's National Catholic Register at a limited time savings of over $17. Stay informed with the latest updates from the Vatican, Washington, D.C., and around the world. From the Jubilee year and canonizations to the new administration and beyond, the award-winning National Catholic Register delivers unparalleled news and analysis through a distinctly Catholic lens. Subscribe today and get it delivered to your home, office, or parish. To subscribe with a special savings of over $17, order online at ncregister.com/radio or call 800-421-3230 and mention code radio. That's ncregister.com/radio or call 800-421-3230 and mention code radio. Don't miss a moment of 2025. Call or click today. The National Catholic Register. Read faithfully.
Hi, this is Father Mike Schmitz.
This is Owen Jensen from EWTN News Nightly.
This is Bishop Robert Barron.
This is Ron Meyer from Blessed to Play.
The most trusted Catholic voices are on EWTN Radio.
On Thursdays, Take Two with Jerry and Debbie, our topic will be Unscripted, where you choose the topic. And now back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
So, what's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? Have you been giving it some thought? I mean, after all, here you are listening to a Catholic network, and maybe you've got some questions about the Catholic faith to get you beyond the 1 yard line. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN, for Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986. Let's go to Moses now in Phoenix, listening on Sirius XM, channel 130. Hello, Moses. What's on your mind today?
Hello, gentlemen. I'm hyper-focused on John 5, and specifically John 5:28 and 29. And I'm loving John 5. But I had the question about the resurrection of the judgment. Like, when he's talking about the resurrection and the judgment in this context, is he talking about that final judgment, or is he talking about, help me, Dr. Anders?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So I believe he's talking about the final judgment, right? But with John, it's always funny because he's got people rising all over the place all the time in all kinds of ways. And so particularly in the Apocalypse, St. Augustine distinguished the spiritual resurrection, that is regeneration to life, and the final resurrection, which is, to eternal salvation or damnation. But since here he tells us that this seems to be connected to judgment specifically, I think we have to infer the final judgment.
Okay. Moses, thanks for your call, and glad you're listening there in Phoenix. Steve is a first-time caller in western Wisconsin, listening on Sirius XM, channel 130. Hey, Steve, what's on your mind today, sir?
Well, I was in prayer meditating the other day, and I was mentally focusing on the mystery of Jesus being found in the temple when he was 12 years old. And it dawned on me to think about this in light of the perpetual virginity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. I know the doctor has spoken to this previously, I'm sure, with regard to the Greek and the adelphoi, including brothers and cousins and possibly nephews, I'm not sure. And then, of course, the words from Jesus at the cross to the Apostle John, behold your mother, and such. But I wondered, if there were other brothers and sisters, you would think that Jesus would not have been the only one lost at the temple, and he was 12 years old. Does that ring anything for you, or has there been anything in the Fathers that has been said to that?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. Well, since the Fathers did not think that Jesus had biological full siblings, they wouldn't have speculated on the absence of Jesus's biological full siblings in the event of the episode in the temple.
Right.
Now, we know that these children were the sons and daughters, among other people, of Clopas and his wife, who also happened to be named Mary. Everybody in the New Testament is named Mary. There's Marys all over the place. But you had Clopas and Mary, the wife of Clopas, who had at least two of the people that were elsewhere named as Jesus' brothers. So, maybe they were back home with Clopas. We also don't know how old they were. So we don't know. Maybe they weren't born, or maybe they were grown-ups. We don't know what the age difference was between Christ and these cousins, right? Mm-hmm. So to me, it don't. And finally, when the Scripture writers, particularly the Gospel writers, give us an historical detail, it's not because they're writing a chronicle of Jesus' life as if they were compiling it from his diaries. Yeah. They're selecting these stories for their theological religious value. And to press those stories into service, answering questions that the gospel writers weren't asking, I think is probably not helpful. We know that the Gospels were not written in chronological order. They don't give us the same order. They tell the same stories in different places, right? They've arranged the material, for their own narrative and theological purposes. And so, yeah, I just don't know that we can press these passages into service for those kind of questions.
Thanks so much for your call, Steve. Glad you're listening to us in Western Wisconsin. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Still time for your call at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Got an email here from Paula that came in over the weekend. I have a question for Dr. Anders. Paula says, a friend that left the Catholic Church bases his exit in Revelation 18:4. Could you please help me understand the context of this verse and what to say to my friend to help him come back to our church? And again, that's from Paula.
Okay, so I'll be honest with you, giving you the context of some verse taken at random out of the book of Revelation on the fly with no prep time is going to be a tall order.
Danger.
All nations have drunk the wine of her wrath and fornication. Come out of her, my people, be no attention. Okay, so all these condemnations of, the whore of Babylon and so forth in the book of Revelation are about the Roman Empire. They're about the Roman Empire. Now, it stands to reason that Protestant polemicists in the 16th and 17th centuries would want to tie the whore of Babylon, which is the Roman Empire, to the See of Rome, to the Bishop of Rome. I just think that's a category mistake, right? The book of Revelation doesn't have the papacy in view positively or negatively. It's not condemning it or approving it. It's setting the Christian faith in contradistinction to the people that were persecuting it, namely the Romans.
Yeah.
And book of Revelation it's not a book about medieval Europe. It's a book about first century Judea, Palestine, and Rome.
Sure. So any ideas on what Paula could say to her friend?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So thank you. I appreciate that. So I would totally avoid the frontal head-on approach. In other words, the last thing I want to do with somebody who's ideologically possessed, by some apocalyptic theory of the Catholic Church and human history, is to engage them pedantically in the details of their theory. I don't want to grace such a theory and such a kind of paranoid view of the world with the dignity of an argument. I really don't. And look, I say that as someone who's perfectly capable of becoming ideologically possessed in my own tiny little, sort of mental world and look down on everybody else outside, from my perfect, sphere of absolute knowledge. I mean, I've been that guy. I get that, okay? And I understand the kind of disposition that leads to it. And I have a great compassion on the thought bubble that you get yourself into when you live in that kind of world. But the last thing in the world you want to do is to tackle it head on because, a lot of people who go in for this, well, they're smart in the sense that they really can line up the facts and figures to fit their theory, right? And they've got an arsenal of evidence that they're going to bring to bear to prove their little pet theory. Now, I think all their evidence is spurious and silly, and it's not going to be persuasive to me at all. But they're utterly persuaded by it, and they're itching for an opportunity to tell you about it, all right? Don't give them an opportunity.
Yeah.
I think the proper approach, in a non-condescending way, of course, is to be like, well, isn't that nice now? Let's come have some tea and cookies, right? You overwhelm them with your humanness, with reality, with children and puppies and blue skies and the reality of suffering and compassion and accompaniment and friendship. And so that, when they finally are ready to get their head out of their self-imposed blender, and they need to know there's someone in the world I can turn to for comfort, and I don't care what their ideology is, that you're that person. That you're that person. Not the person that they wrangle with ideologically, but the person they know they can trust because you're fundamentally good. And oh, by the way, you're a Catholic.
There you go. Paula, thanks so much for your email. We hope that is helpful for you. Call to communion here on EWTN. Let's go to Sarah now. Sarah is in Tyrone, Pennsylvania, listening on the great JMJ Catholic Radio. Hi, Sarah. What's on your mind today?
Yes, hello. During the beginning of the Mass at the collect, when the priest blesses himself, are the laity supposed to also bless themselves?
That's a really good question. And I have to confess, I've not read the rubrics on this particular question. I don't think so. At the Confiteor, yes, that's much more common. I don't have any conscious memory of consistently making the sign of the cross at the collect. Correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, but that doesn't seem right to me.
I don't think so.
But at the Confiteor, yeah.
Perhaps a priest may be listening to our show right now.
Who's got the rubrics in front of him every day.
Yeah,
since I don't say the Mass, I just kind of go with the flow when I'm there,
Sarah, thanks so much for your call. Call to communion here. We can still get in one or two more phone calls if you call right now. 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. We still air the wonderful broadcasts from Father Benedict Groeschel of happy memory, and that's because they're good. They're timeless. That's why we carry so much Mother Angelica content here on the network. You can check out The Wisdom of Father Groeschel Saturday mornings, 1 a.m. Eastern, and that would be Friday evenings if you're on the West Coast, 10 p.m. Pacific, right here on EWTN Radio. Back to the phones in just a second. This question from Anna Maria in Atlanta. Dr. Anders, I find myself in a constant defense of my Catholic faith. Why is it so difficult for others to respect Catholic beliefs? I don't want to go to other religious groups to prove my Catholic faith. I love everything about my faith. How would you keep others from inviting you to other churches?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. So I don't think this is what you're dealing with, all right? But there are religions in the world that they're not. I think the she's from Atlanta, right?
Yeah.
Not so many of them in Atlanta, thankfully. But there are religions in the world who believe it is their sacred duty to militarily conquer you and subject you to their theocratic regime, right? There are lots of places in the world actually that are suffering under just that specific ideology, all right? And the fact that you don't want to go conquer somebody militarily and subject them to your theocratic regime is irrelevant to them, right? That's what they want to do.
Yeah.
How do you persuade someone out of that? Well, not as severe a case, but what if you live in a community where others practice a religion where an article of their religion, an article of faith in their religion is Catholics are to be proselytized. And as a Catholic, you're accustomed to a form of spirituality that's oriented towards, how can I become more just? How can I become more loving? How can I become more humble? It's really about perfecting yourself after the image of Christ and his charity.
Uh-huh.
There are other spiritualities outside the Catholic Church that are not oriented that way, and instead have their orientation towards, how can I get more people to think like me? I know I speak from experience because that's how I grew up. That's the tradition I grew up in.
Yeah.
And I'm not kidding you. This is for real. I grew up in a tradition that taught me that the only good Catholic is a converting Catholic, one who's converting to my brand of Christianity.
Wow.
And that Catholicism itself is harmful and that would lead people to hell. And that it was my moral and Christian duty to persuade Catholics to leave their faith. And in fact, to do that, to engage in the work of proselytizing, the attempt to convert Catholics away from Catholicism, specifically Catholicism, I mean, not just any religion, but Catholics specifically, to go after Catholics was regarded as a particularly meritorious and valuable thing. And one that would win you lots of kudos in the tradition. If you could convert a Catholic, man, feather in your cap, bud. And there are a lot of churches that are filled with ex-Catholics who have been suckered in by this pitch and others like it. Remember that if you look at the doctrinal statements of the Catholic tradition, the great creeds and confessions, like, say, the Nicene Creed, you'll notice that, I believe in God the Father, the Almighty, and oh, by the way, those other guys are wrong. I don't believe that. That's not part of the thing.
No.
And but in many of the Protestant, Reformed and Lutheran confessions, there are specific articles in there that anathematize Catholicism. We believe this, and the Pope's the Antichrist.
Wow.
And I mean, this is hard for you to understand.
Yeah, I understand.
But there are people who grow up like really being taught as part of their identity, don't be Catholic. That's how I grew up. How do you, in my case, how did I get over that? Well, one kind Catholic wasn't enough. It wasn't. But it helped. I had this college buddy named Dave. And Dave was the last person in the world to try to proselytize anybody else. But he also wasn't shy about his religion, his Catholic faith. He didn't hide it from people, right? He wore a crucifix, and he would tell you about how much he loved his Jesuit high school, and he went to Mass, and we all knew Dave was Catholic. And everybody else, in the city of New Orleans would go out and get sloppy drunk, but not Dave. He'd have a beer and shoot some pool, but he just kind of laughed at the people that were the idiots getting sloppy drunk. He wasn't sanctimonious or preachy, but there was something different about him, and he was a good fellow. And you could tell it had something to do with his Catholic faith. And I didn't become Catholic because I hung out with Dave. But years later, when I started studying the Catholic faith and thinking about it, it was the Daves of the world that had sort of built up in my moral imagination and that lent context and credibility to what I was learning in the great fathers of the church, like Augustine or St.
They were
Thomas.
living it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so it created a kind of aura of plausibility around Catholicism to me, and showed me that there's a different way to be a human being. And so it's a brick in the road, but you can be that brick in the road to that fellow.
Absolutely. Anna Maria, thanks for listening to us in Atlanta. We hope that's helpful for you. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Let's go to St. Louis, talk with Margaret, listening on the Great Covenant Network. Hi, Margaret. What's on your mind today?
Yes. Hello.
Hi.
I'm wondering, quite a while back, I read that there are churches called Catholic, and that the Roman Catholic is the Church of Jesus Christ. And why is it called Roman Catholic?
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate the question. So the word Catholic means universal. It's just Greek for universal. And it's first used in the very early 2nd century by a Catholic bishop named Ignatius of Antioch, who refers to sort of the commonality of all the Christian churches that are in union together in one faith by this word universal or Catholic. The word is not as important as the reality. The reality is that Jesus intended to establish a visible institution. Christ founded an organization to perpetuate his message and the grace that he brings. And he established it with lines of authority. He, put certain people in charge. He gave them doctrines, rites, and rituals to perpetuate, and a commission to continue that organization till he came again, till the end of time. And as that group went out into the world, they were, in union with one another. Thus, the origins of what we now call the Catholic Church. Now, what happened is, since Christ sent those people out to the four corners of the world, they went to the four corners of the world. They went to different areas, and they went to different language groups, different ethnicity, different cultures. And so they were all still one thing, but locally they began to take on regional variations, particularly in language, but also, some of the embellishments that grew up around the celebration of those rites and ceremonies. And a very large and important, but by far for the only branch of that development took place in the Latin-speaking countries that more or less, lined up with the borders of the Roman Empire. And so the part of the Catholic world that falls within that sort of Latinate framework we call Roman. And there's more to it than that, because each of these areas fell under the control of a particularly important bishop. And, not all bishops are created equal, so to speak, and some have wider jurisdiction than others. And the Bishop of Rome had a specific jurisdiction over the Latin churches. Now, it turns out his jurisdiction is wider than that, but there's a specific thing that he has with the Latin churches. Whereas, say, there's a bishop in Antioch that has a jurisdiction over, Eastern churches that are connected to Syria, right, and so forth.
Yeah.
In Byzantium, in Constantinople, is another bishop who has a specific jurisdiction over the Byzantine churches, right? So in a particular sense, we talk about Roman Catholicism when we're talking about the branch of the Catholic Church that is specifically and uniquely under the domain of the Bishop of Rome and has Latin as its historic language of law and liturgy. Now, as opposed to, say, the Byzantines, which have Greek and other languages and so forth. Now, there's one other catch, and that is that the Bishop of Rome is the top dog of all the bishops, including the ones that have this broad jurisdiction. And so he is where the buck ultimately stops, whether you are a Roman Catholic or a Byzantine Catholic or a Coptic Catholic or whatever kind of Catholic you are, the buck always stops at the Bishop of Rome. So he's both the primate, the patriarch of the Latin Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, but he's also the universal pastor of all Catholics everywhere.
Great call, Margaret. Thanks for checking in from St. Louis. Let's go now to Central Kansas. Here is Alan, listening on the great Divine Mercy Radio. Hey, Alan, what's on your mind today, sir?
Hey, I was looking for some additional resources sometimes the homilies that are delivered on Mass on Sunday don't carry I don't think they carry enough punch, or they're hard to follow. And so I was looking for some additional resources as far as a reflection on the readings of the day to enhance my church experience.
Oh boy. Yes, I relate to this question. Okay, very much so. So there's a really great resource. It was published by the Congregation for Divine Worship, and it's not designed for lay people, although lay people can use it. It's designed for priests. And would that every priest in the world would use it. That they would use it, okay? It's called the Homiletical Directory. And it gives tips on what to preach about for every liturgy in the year.
Yeah.
And it's darn good. And if priests did nothing else other than draw the content of their homilies from the suggestions of the Homiletical Directory. I mean, they don't have to slavishly copy it word for word, but they just pull the major themes and points of analysis from. I mean, homilies would go up.
Yeah,
so much. The quality would go so much better. That's what it's there for. To be a resource. And so, as lay people, you can look at the Homiletical Directory too, and then you can go, wish Father had preached from this text today, That's one line of approach. There are many services that, for a fee will distribute commentary on Mass readings on a, daily or weekly basis. I think, doesn't Dr. Brant Petrie have one of these services, I think?
I believe so.
Scott, I'm pretty sure has one. And so a lot of well-known Catholic biblical scholars will put out their commentaries on them.
Well, I would also point out EWTN.
Oh, yeah, well, there's that too.
We get emails every day, literally every day, from viewers, from listeners who say, that was a fantastic homily I heard this morning. Thanks for posting it on demand. And you can listen to the Mass on demand. You can listen to the homily on demand. And, of course, you can hear the broadcast every morning at 8 a.m. Eastern on EWTN radio and television. That will help you a little bit down the road.
Yep. Agreed. Now, but I want to back up and make one last sort of qualifying statement.
Yeah.
And that is that, in my judgment, you should never evaluate your experience at liturgy in terms of the homily, with respect to the homily. Because the homily, unlike a Protestant sermon, the point of the Mass is not primarily to receive instruction. I mean, the church is all about instructing you, and there's a lot of avenues to get instructed. But the homily is really there as a kind of accompaniment to the sacrifice of the Mass.
Yes.
And the important thing is the disposition that you bring to the holy sacrifice, not the information that you acquire from the homily.
Great point. Thanks for bringing it up. Alan in Central Kansas, thanks so much for your call. We have time for Charlie in Michigan, listening on Sirius XM Channel 130. Charlie, we just have a couple of minutes here. What's on your mind?
I understand from reading the New Testament there's no mention of the destruction of the temple. And does that mean that the New Testament was written before 70 A.D.?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So I beg to differ. And I think most biblical scholars would hold that the four Gospels were all written after the destruction of the temple, or at least contemporaneous with it. So sometimes people will date Mark to 70, but Mark is generally viewed as the first Gospel, and Luke and Matthew being kind of borrowing from Mark, and John even further than that. And so the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus talks about the destruction of the temple, I mean, from the point of view of the text, it's a prophecy. Most biblical scholars think that the sacred writers are writing with the benefit of hindsight. John likes to write in a very veiled and oblique manner. So like when he talks about the sacraments, he uses sort of very suggestive language of being born by water and the Spirit and eating the flesh and blood of Christ without actually mentioning the consecrated species.
Mm-hmm.
But we know what he's talking about.
Yeah.
In the same way, say, Jesus' confrontation with the Samaritan woman, where he says, a time is coming when you're not going to worship the Father on this mountain. I mean, seems like, duh.
Yeah.
I know what he's talking about.
Sure. Appreciate that. Charlie, glad we could get your question in today. Tom in Vermont, you've got a great question, but we're all out of time. Could you please call us back tomorrow? We will put you, when you call in, at the head of the line. So do that, please, Tom, and we'll look forward to snagging your question tomorrow's program. Hey, Dr. David Anders, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Tom.
We do it right here on EWTN Radio at 2 p.m. Eastern for Call to Communion each and every Monday through Friday. Check out that podcast by going to EWTN.com, click on radio, and then look for Podcast Central. On behalf of our fantastic team, I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. Hey, thanks for joining us. See you tomorrow on the Friday edition of Call to Communion. Until then, God bless.